We are honored today to welcome our guest speaker to the stage, MayKao. MayKao is currently the CEO and president of the Empress H. Wilder Foundation, a nonprofit health and human services organization that has been serving the greater St. Paul area since 1906. MayKao has received her Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology from Brown University and a Master's of Arts in Social Policy and Distributive Justice from the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs. She currently serves as the chair of the Twin Cities Local Initiative Support Collaboration, a trustee of the St. Paul and Minnesota Community Foundations, and is on the advisory committee of the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation.
MayKao và hai offer là cho cái sự đầu MayKao tiếp cận giá đại bachelor's degree cởi cho training chất lượng xã ở nước Việt Nam Brown University. Chúng ta nên là khi MayKao offer về cái đại master's degree ở nước Việt Nam University Minnesota lúc học Institute. Khi MayKao mà tác động của offer cho công hội nó hỗ trợ nó để tăng cái basic thì họ để chơi MayKao
Chúng ta hẹn lưu ở Hmong Student Association chính phủ thì cũng như sáng đó nó thì là cho cụ tôi hai mình chỉ lưu này nó những việc thì cho rồi cho hai đồng cả trong sáng cái nó cụ chỉ hai đồng Hmong tàu cái thọ này cái này cái gì tôi nói này chỉ là hai đồng cả nè cụ thọ cái này ra cái gì cho cụ sau đó tới cả đó có cho rồi là tao cụ trong này. So I just really want to thank you all for inviting me to speak today. You've already heard my introduction, the long introduction of my bio, but what you might not know about me is that I lead an organization in St. Paul that for over 100 years has only had white men who have been the leaders of the organization. The Wilder Foundation has existed for 106 years, and in all of that time, there have only been 6 presidents of the organization. I'm the 6th president of the Wilder Foundation, and the Wilder Foundation's mission is to serve the poor, sick, and needy of the greater St. Paul area, which means that it serves a lot of Hmong people. So I'm really proud to be here to represent the Wilder Foundation, but I'm prouder still to be here to represent my Hmong community, which is why I was asked to speak. So when I asked Jonathan why I was invited to speak, he said that for many years, this event has had Hmong male leaders speaking, and they thought it was time to invite a Hmong woman leader to come and speak. So I come to you as also a mother of 4 children, and someone who's really proud of my children. I have both a son and daughters. And when I look at all of you who are students here at the university, I see the future of the Hmong community and the promise of the future and the potential that you have to really make a difference. It's always welcome to come back also because I'm a graduate of the University of Minnesota. I graduated from the Humphrey Institute, and in fact I just saw one of my fellow colleagues here whose daughter is your vice president, so that was kind of fun. So when I asked Jonathan what you guys might like to hear about, what he said was that he just wanted me to share a little bit about my life and my journey in particular with education. Because at the time that I went to school, there were not very many Hmong women or girls who were actually allowed to go to school very far away. So I thought I would share my story, and hopefully for many of you who are parents in this audience, you'll also see this story as part of your story, and for those of you who came to the United States later, you'll probably see yourself reflected in my story. Because the story of our Hmong people is a very common story, and it's a story that starts, for me, in a very small village in Laos where I was born. Without healthcare, my mother actually caught me as I came out because everybody else was in the fields. And in those old days, there was no healthcare. There was no person to help her. So she was alone when I was born, and like so many Hmong mothers before her, she gave birth in silence without uttering or screaming a sound. Because I was the daughter of a teacher, I was given a birth certificate because it proved that my father could claim a larger allowance every month from the Lao government. My story is also the story of my parents because none of us can achieve anything that we've accomplished alone. Regardless of whether we respect the people who gave birth to us or helped us along the way, they're a part of us and we're a part of them. We are never truly alone, even if it feels like it sometimes in our journey to become educated. So I need to actually tell you the story of my parents because it's also my story. My father was only unusual in that out of the entire province of Xiangkhouang, Laos, where he was born, and this was in the days of French Indochina, he was only one of 3 students who tested into the only university at the time, the University of Dong Duc in Vientiane, Laos. Unlike many other more privileged Hmong who had fathers or uncles who worked with the CIA and who had worked with the French colonists, my father had no wealth of any kind. He had his mind, his body, and his desire to learn, but he was very poor, even for being a Hmong person in the hills. And at the age of 11, he witnessed one of his best friends being killed in his home village. His friend was shot in the head with a gun and died instantly. His young friend had been causing some trouble with neighbors in other villages. He was completely unable to understand the Lao language. The government officials came to the village, proclaimed that this boy should be killed. When his name was called out, he raised his hand, and then he was killed. Now you can imagine what that did to a boy of my father's age. My grandfather then turned to him and said this would be my father's fate if he did not free himself of the ignorance of being a Hmong person. Right? So for years, maybe months, I don't know, according to my dad, he sat outside of the village school where mostly it was Laotian kids who were allowed to go and learn. Because the Hmong, even back then in Laos, were hill tribe people. My father had no birth certificate. He was already 11. And most of the children nearby actually had some money. He had no status to legitimately enroll to go to school. Finally, my mother, who was from a very powerful Li clan, took pity on him and took her to see her brother, who helped make up a birth certificate. From then on, my father was able to go to school, but his struggles were not over. Even though school was free in the mountains mostly, he had no paper or pencils with which to write. Every lesson that the teacher gave, he had to memorize himself. He had to borrow or beg for materials from friends or relatives. My grandfather was an opium addict, like so many Hmong before him, and did not support my father's education. His mother had many children to take care of and to feed. So my father was mostly on his own. Usually he was in rags. He carried water and cut firewood for wealthier Hmong families who would give him enough money to support his learning. Often when there was no work, he would write on tree bark and find the charred wood from the fire, making it slim and thin so that he could write. Despite his challenges, he was a very smart student. He was terrific. He excelled at his lessons, and the burning desire inside of him to succeed made him continue. But the Lao government was corrupt, and for 2 years he could not test into the university because, as he discovered, the names of wealthier Lao students were being cut off and pasted onto his test. So he gave up and used his reading and writing to become a scribe for the army. On the way, he met my mother, a 15-year-old farm girl whose mother had just died. Now, my mother's story was that she was not allowed an education, even though my grandparents, on her side, were actually much wealthier than my father's family. It was because she was a girl. She claims that she was the smartest girl in her family, the smartest kid in her family, but each time she would beg to go to school, her parents would hand her a hoe and shoo her off to go to the fields. It was with much bitterness and the taste of defeat each time, from being a young child to being a young woman, that she was sent to the fields and her brother was sent to school. Because she would marry one day and benefit someone else's clan, she wasn't worth investing in. And she only had one brother, and that was where the money was going to go. So in 1975, when the country was at war, because my father was a teacher and because he did not believe in the war, and he did not serve in the army, he was thrown into what the French call a seminar. What's a seminar? A seminar is a very nice French word for a re-education camp. While he was at the seminar, my mother and the three of us girls tried to flee our village, but we didn't make it. We were saved by a village of lepers. They saved us because my mother had paid a cousin of hers to lead us to safety and to Thailand, and by the time that we got down near where the border was, the cousin had betrayed all of the villagers. The soldiers opened fire and we ran. We ran into a village of lepers, and they sheltered us while my uncle tried to go find my dad. On the second try, we actually made it over to Thailand, and we lived in a refugee camp for 1 whole year. So finally, at the age of 4, having cheated death, I was resettled into Milwaukee, Wisconsin, into a working class neighborhood where I was promptly baptized, and we started going to church, and we had to adjust to a new language and a new land. My father's first job was working in a bowling alley, cleaning out ashtrays during the graveyard shift from 3 to 8 a.m. in the morning. He thought he had actually dropped right into hell. The punk rockers with mohawks, blue hair, heavy drinking, and cigarette smoke made him sick, and he thought he had entered the land of monsters. And perhaps, and now thinking back to then, all those stories in the refugee camp about Nya must have been about these people. The country was so big and no one could support him or my mother. Those were very hard times for us kids and for them. Dying as an adult was no longer a choice, because what would happen to all of us children? And then my mother was pregnant again. We were homeless and often hungry. We had to rely on the help of strangers who didn't speak our language. Many times there was not enough food to eat. And also the type of food was horrible. My mother talks about eating Uncle Ben's rice and not knowing how her body could digest all of the sugar and the donuts and the baked goods. She craved real Hmong rice, and she didn't know how to drive. She would go to the grocery store with our sponsors and point to things that she wanted to eat, but she says that they wouldn't buy them. Then, after yet another birth, when my baby brother was born, the worst thing ever happened to her. She was sterilized. Her tubes were tied without her consent. She put an X on the form and she didn't know what she was doing in the hospital. As a Hmong woman, her major source of pride, her ability to bear children, was over because she was illiterate, because she did not understand what she was doing. Her pride and her womanhood were taken away from her without her knowledge. My mother would make her way in the world thereafter as a woman of little worth because she could not bear more sons. She had only one, and on one son she would pin in place all of her future hope and love. My father had heard that St. Paul was a great place to live, so we moved to St. Paul in 1978. My mom would try to find work and rebuild a life after recovering from her surgery. She was only 27. Can you imagine? That's younger than I am now by 12 years, and not much older than all of you. My mother, I have to say, is one of the most amazing people I've ever been privileged to know. She worked 2 jobs, went to school herself, graduated from a 2-year college, raised 5 children who all graduated from some of the best schools in the country. All her children are successful. Everybody has a good life. But impossibly at the time, while growing up, my life as a small child was in a dark cloud most of the time. None of what I'm telling you, everything that I'm telling you about my parents, was nothing that I knew while I was growing up. To me, my parents were just not really cool people who were actually making my life miserable. My dad was always running around trying to start another Hmong community organization and save more Hmong refugees, and my mother would often spend her afternoons on the bus dragging us around to help more Hmong people down at the welfare office. There was always some new cousin tagging along with me at school that I had to get registered. I was always showing them around and trying to help them make friends. And then my reward was usually that if I finished my homework, I would have to help all my cousins or uncles or aunts with their homework. Our house was literally a social services and community center. If I wasn't studying myself, I was doing someone else's homework, interpreting at the clinic or hospital with a family member, or cooking and cleaning because I was a girl. I hated babysitting. I hated babies. I much preferred to do my uncle's homework. I know this is really funny because I have 4 children now. I much preferred to actually do my uncle's homework at Inver Hills Community College. In my years of growing up in St. Paul, I not only did my homework, I did my younger siblings' homework, I did my uncle's homework, my mom's homework, often my dad's homework. I did college level work at the age of 12 when I was at Cleveland Junior High, and I used to hate it. What did I care for foreshadowing, metaphors, and the personification of inanimate objects in English literature? In a really huge fit one evening, I think I must have been about 13, I was really tired of doing other people's homework, I called my uncle stupid. I had been trying to teach him his English lesson forever, and he just couldn't get it. He left in a huff, and then he never returned again. After a very long lecture from my dad, who told me that the gift of a fine mind and knowledge that I had gained needed to be accepted with that gift, the generosity and kindness of others seeking my help. I slinked off to my bedroom and I never complained again. But it was too late because that uncle was done with me. Much of my rebellion as a young person, I have to say, was trying to navigate through the public schools because nobody could understand me. I felt smothered. I felt terrible about who I was. I had no idea who I was. Was I Chinese? Was I Korean? Was I Japanese? What was Hmong anyway? Was it some terrible group that was set out to torture me as a young girl doing homework? By then, my parents' relationship was also falling apart. My father started seeing other women, and my mother cried all the time. They were both struggling with mental health issues, and they were both depressed. If I ever wanted to see my mom, because she worked so hard, I had to go to evening high school with her at Central in St. Paul, where of course I would learn her lessons, reteach them to her, and then feel proud when she passed a class. There were no books allowed in my house lower than a table, because if my dad ever found a book on the floor, all hell would break loose. Knowledge was to be revered and treated as if it were holy. If I brought home anything less than an A, it was a 30-minute lecture, and sometimes it was an hour-long lecture. Since I never understood where all this was coming from, never taking the time to understand my parents, I just thought he was a cranky dad. Little did I know back then that the luxury of having pencils and paper meant that life was far easier for me in school than it had ever been for him in all of his studies, and he still tested into the only University of Laos. I guess this might have been due to his knowledge that the servitude and enslavement of us Hmong people for over 2,000 years can be attributed to our ignorance of the written word. Because of our insular Hmong culture, we've been persecuted for generations. Now that's not necessarily bad because we have a great oral tradition, right? Our tradition becomes alive with our culture through song, through ritual, through embroidery, through other means of communicating. But because we were not able to compete and speak with others to build our own history, to express our own views, we were a people who have been left to study ourselves through the eyes of other people, other people's history. Fast forward. So by the time I was a teenager, I was getting pretty smart about thinking about ways of escaping from my family and doing spectacular things that other Hmong girls weren't doing at the time. In the late 1980s, all of my friends, my Hmong friends, started getting married to each other. And yet, I was the one who dreamt about traveling, going to college, running away from the Hmong community, and doing something else with my life. I was afraid that if I turned to look at my friends, I would cave under the pressure of becoming a gang member or seeing a mere marriage as the solution to freedom so that I could do what I want. But seeing so many of my female friends be unhappy was not what I wanted in my life because marriage was just something else that took more time. So when I was 16, I won what I would consider the Hmong lottery, okay? The Hmong kid lottery. I became an exchange student to Germany. Wow, wasn't that wonderful? But for me, running away to Germany still made me think more about being Hmong than I had ever thought. Because how can you run away from who you are? How can you learn about another culture when you're not willing to explore and understand your own? It was a turning point in my life when I realized that anything worth knowing had to start with myself, my family, my parents, and our Hmong culture. I'm sure you've been there, right? Because the questions I had yet to ask my parents were the questions that I really needed to know about in order to become someone great. Because great is not what you are, great is what you become. So when I got into college, I was thrilled to gain entrance into one of the best institutions in the country, Brown University, an Ivy League college, on full scholarship. The journey to get to college was fraught with many hurdles, and I'm sure for some of you this is also true. But getting into an Ivy League university was something that was beyond my wildest dreams. By the age of 18, then, I had already escaped Laos with my parents, lived in a refugee camp, faced starvation and death, learned how to maneuver in a different country, studied abroad, finished high school single, and interpreted for more people than I could possibly count using my Hmong language skills. I had suppressed my desire to be the same as other young Hmong women and fueled my own determination to go to college and finish school. But like my father, I went to school ill-equipped to compete with some of the best minds and students of the whole country. I was on full scholarship and I couldn't afford a computer. I went with a typewriter that had a printing function that didn't work. It took me twice as long to write papers at Brown, which I couldn't possibly finish and compete with other students there. Most of them came from wealthy families, and this did not describe my own family situation. I had to work 2 part-time jobs in addition to my scholarship to make ends meet. I never saw a new movie that was released until my senior year at Brown University. The only movies that I could make were the ones that were replays that cost $2 to get in to see. When my friends went off skiing in Colorado, I sat at Brown University cooking my own dinners because the meal plan was too expensive for me. I pretended that things were fine to my family and to my friends, but they weren't. I was completely out of my league. There was some relief once computer clusters came in and I could actually access a computer. I just had to find time to write on the computer when the computer was vacant or when the cluster leaders didn't kick me out because I had spent too much time there. It became a game for me of watch and wait so that I could be as organized as possible to finish my papers on time. Students who come from wealth have no idea what it means like to be a first-generation college student, to struggle even with the basic necessities of life, to have clothes to wear that look like everybody else's. For example, it wasn't like I was trying to be antisocial when I was at Brown University. I simply didn't think that spending money on beer was the way that I should be saving my hard-earned cash. I wanted to fly home to Minnesota to see my parents and my brothers and sisters to make sure that they were doing okay. Those dark days at the dorm when everyone was on vacation and coming back home to the Hmong New Year, I sat at Brown University by myself. I'm sure that some of you can maybe relate to what I'm talking to. As I was struggling, I went one day to my mailbox, and an aunt who lived on welfare at the time, sent me a crisp $20 bill to spend. Now you have to understand that for me as a Hmong girl, nobody thought that I could actually go to college. Everybody thought I would be coming home pregnant and it is a disgrace. That $20 has been the only gift that I have ever received, to past or present, while I've been in school from a family member. I couldn't help fighting back the tears when I held that crisp $20 bill in my hand. It symbolized pure love and generosity from someone who couldn't even afford it herself. I have compared my education and my investments from my extended family that they made in me to those of my Hmong men fellow peers, and there isn't even a comparison. It's not that my extended family or my clan never thought of me, it's just that they didn't think of me. They thought less of me. I believe I was not worth the investment. When I went home on vacations, nobody ever pressed a crisp $20 bill into my palm of my hand so that I could go to school and watch a movie. People are never poor because of money. They become poor because of isolation and a lack of connection. In my case, as a young Hmong woman perhaps, not worth investing in enough for a return later on from my clan because I would eventually be married into some other family. Once my mother caught me crying and I was very angry about not having any spending money. And she was very angry herself because my parents were generous people and they always gave me spending money, but no one else. Finally, she shook me out of my anger and said, no one helps you now while you're in school. When you graduate, you owe them nothing. And you know what? That's true. Today, I can claim that every single step of the way with my education, nobody can claim anything or tell me that they helped me with anything, because no one in fact did, except my own parents. And you know what? That's a bitter feeling, but what it does for me today is it's freed me of the family obligation that maybe so many people have. It's paid off by saying that I have an independent will and that I can achieve, and that if I choose to spend my time talking to those of you who are in this audience who may or may not be related to me, that is my right. I did not need to be indebted to those who were blind to my abilities and truly did not wish me to succeed. The naysayers would just have to wait to see how my life turned out, until they could be sad, perhaps, that they didn't invest in me. I have a very strong-willed sister who told me once that when Hmong women go to college, others are waiting to see them fail. But when a Hmong man goes to college, others are waiting to see them succeed. They're both in college, but the expectations of failure are far greater than the expectations of success. I have no idea whether this is true for others or not, but it certainly was true for me in my generation. I was expected to disgrace the family, come home pregnant, and run off to marry someone who was not from the Hmong culture. Or, as a male cousin of mine who was also in college said to me at the time, college Hmong women are used goods and not worth marrying for a man like me. Contrary to these beliefs, I did actually marry a wonderful Hmong man when I was 24. And, of course, even though I didn't like babysitting, I have 4 beautiful children. I've gotten over that part. My husband is as educated and progressive as I am, and together we're showing the world what kind of marriage being Hmong can look like in the community, where all children are valued for their talents and abilities, and they're equally loved. Before I would marry, however, I finished an advanced degree in public affairs at the University of Minnesota, and again as a scholarship student, because I kept excelling. I was stuck in computer labs, working harder than ever to crunch all of those numbers in those public policy classes. I graduated from the Humphrey Institute in 1996. I had just turned 23. I finished school really fast. And at this age, I was suddenly able to apply my public policy knowledge in a way that I never thought would happen. I was sent with a Hmong delegation to Ban Na Po Repatriation Center to help give cultural orientation and medical processing for refugees who had refused to come to the US from Ban Vinai, from all those other camps. Because of my efforts and the colleagues that I had, there were hundreds of Hmong families who, without proper documentation, and because they couldn't read or write or tell their own stories, they were allowed to resettle into the United States. I am responsible, my friends, for 2,500 Hmong people who would not have been able to come to the United States, being able to come to the United States. There are mostly women and small children whose husbands had died in the war and who could not demonstrate that they had any military connection of any kind. My greatest joy in learning and advocating after this was knowing that several babies had been named after me for my work on this project. Not only had education benefited me personally, it had helped me help others to set them free of the conditions of being a refugee and living in poverty in Thailand or being sent back to Laos. Education has freed me to participate in the world, to speak out for myself, to be the creator of knowledge and just not the consumer of knowledge, to be a part of our Hmong history. It is through our lived experiences and our documentation that I can now write my own story and tell you what I have lived through. I don't have to read my story that other people are writing. I can do it myself. And it's true, I'm not even done with school yet. I'm in a doctoral program at Hamlin University working on a dissertation. And just like you, I'm still studying every day. On the days when I'm a bit tired of school, like this morning when I left my home again at 7 a.m. to read and do work on my dissertation, I have to remember that I am a Hmong person and I come from hardy stock. I am not just studying for myself, I am studying for all of you too. The story of being Hmong is so much more fascinating than the story of being Korean, of being Chinese, of being Japanese, of being any other culture. Being Hmong is something I love. It's central to my identity, something to be proud of, both the good and the bad. Because I am Hmong and because I can never run away from myself, celebrations like the Hmong New Year are something that are very important. To be educated is to not be wise. I was not someone who could understand the value of my own worth and what education can bring to me until I learned that we as people never spring out of nothing. There are people who came before us, on whose shoulders we stand, and whose hands have closed around ours through many generations of struggle, sometimes even 2,000 years. So here's what education has meant for me. The education of my father and the lack of education of my mother were both the motivators for me to succeed. And in fact, education kept our family alive. Education is what set me free to embrace my Hmong heritage and to be proud. Education and literacy has enabled me to read, write, and speak my own truth. Education has taught me how to think critically, how to re-script and change my life and not let others define who I can become, but for me to define it for myself. Education has forced me to ask questions each time I am challenged about whether I'm right or wrong. Education has allowed me to live in the world of ideas so that I can evaluate for myself what other people are saying about me as a Hmong person and the values I should hold. Education is a means to achieve equity. The enslavement of the Hmong people and the servitude that we've experienced for 2,000 years is now over. To achieve a better world for all of us, men and women, we all need to be educated and question where is our future headed and how do we be a part of that. Now, you may attain your heart's desire and see the path to learning, just as finishing college or graduate school, but I'm telling you today that if you do not apply your learning and you aren't a force for good in the world, then your learning means nothing. Being educated means taking on the responsibility for the whole community and for all of us and each other to meet our Hmong people where they are at. Sometimes when I see educated Hmong people, they make fun of the people who are not educated. They make fun of the elderly person who still sits in public housing and who still mourns the loss of a homeland, never to be reached again. I meet my people where they're at. Everybody asks, MayKao, how did you get to where you are? And I tell them, I meet my people where they're at. Because I don't expect that person to be like me. To value what each of us brings into the world, whether educated or not, is the burden of responsibility for those of us who become educated. It brings us to the table to create a better world for all of us. It provides us the tolerance and patience to be better people. And it creates a better future for all of us as a community. Thank you.
Attribute to our Hmong community and community at large. You are a really great inspiration to all of us. Your words motivate us to continue our education and give back to our community.
nó là bia cái lúc này theo phải cái chút gì nó bé sờ đằng của trong đầu nè để nó cái cái đi là free cho mà con
She's the whole house.